Picture this. A B-17 bomber screaming through the sky over Nazi Germany, its tail section nearly severed, hanging on by nothing but control cables. 3 of its 4 engines are destroyed. The fuselage has a hole you could drive a jeep through, and the crew can literally see the ground 20,000 feet below through the shattered floor. German pilots have pumped over 500 rounds into this aircraft. By every law of physics and engineering, this plane should be a flaming coffin plummeting to Earth, but instead, it flies home. It lands safely, and the next day mechanics patch it up and send it back into combat. This isn't a one-time miracle. This happened hundreds of times during World War II. And the reason why will blow your mind, because the B-17, U-10 Juno, was never the plane that actually fought the war. What you're about to discover is how American mechanics and combat pilots took a fundamentally flawed design and transformed it into a flying tank that absolutely refused to die, no matter what the Luftwaffe threw at it. When Egtvedt stood in Boeing's Seattle factory in 1934, watching the gleaming prototype of Model 299 take shape, he believed he was looking at the future of American air power, a 4-engine bomber that could fly higher, farther, and carry more ordnance than anything in the world. The press immediately dubbed it the Flying Fortress after seeing the 5 machine gun positions bristling from its sleek aluminum skin. And Egtvedt's engineering team was convinced they had created an aerial battleship that could fight its way through any defense and deliver its payload with surgical precision. But when the first B-17s arrived in England in the summer of 1942, as part of Eighth Air Force's daylight bombing campaign, the brutal reality of combat over Nazi-occupied Europe shattered every assumption Egtvedt and his team had made. Luftwaffe fighters Focke-Wulf 190s and Mi-109s flown by battle-hardened Osses tore through the early B-17E and F models with horrifying efficiency, exploiting blind spots in the defensive armament that allowed them to make head-on attacks where the bombers' nose guns couldn't traverse fast enough to track them. German pilots quickly learned that a diving attack from 12 o'clock high straight into the cockpit gave them a 4-second window where American gunners couldn't return effective fire, and they used this tactic to devastating effect during missions over Wilhelmshaven, Bremen, and the Ruhr Valley. The losses were catastrophic on the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943. 60 B-17s were shot down out of 376 bombers dispatched, a loss rate of nearly 16%. That was simply unsustainable by any calculation of attrition warfare. Crews returned with horrific stories of watching fortresses explode in midair. After taking 20mm cannon fire to the bomb bay, or seeing ships spiral down in flames with their oxygen systems ruptured and gunners frozen at their posts at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero. General Ira Ika, commander of the 8th Air Force, sent desperate cables back to Washington warning that unless the B-17 was fundamentally redesigned to address its vulnerabilities, the entire strategic bombing campaign would fail before it achieved any meaningful degradation of German industrial capacity. What happened next was not a single breakthrough by one visionary engineer, but rather a massive coordinated effort involving hundreds of mechanics, crew chiefs, armament specialists, and combat-experienced pilots who took Egtvedt's original design and transformed it through thousands of field modifications into something that could absorb punishment that would obliterate any other aircraft in existence. Tibbets, who would later command the Enola Gay, was among the first operational pilots to advocate loudly for specific modifications. After flying early missions and watching his squadron get decimated, he worked directly with technical representatives from Boeing Wright-Patterson, field engineers, and supply officers to retrofit bombers with additional armor plating around crew positions. Not the lightweight aluminum skin Egtvedt had specified, but genuine steel plate that added over 500 pounds to the aircraft's weight, but could stop rifle-caliber rounds and shrapnel that had been killing bombardiers and pilots. The self-sealing fuel tanks that Egtvedt's original design lacked became standard equipment after mechanics witnessed too many. Fortresses turned into flying coffins when tracer rounds ignited fuel cells, and these new tanks used multiple layers of rubber compounds that automatically expanded when punctured to seal bullet holes before fuel could leak, vaporize into explosive fumes. But the most critical modification was the addition of the Cinturita power-operated twin 50 caliber machine gun mount installed directly beneath the nose that eliminated the deadly blind spot German fighters had been exploiting since 1942. when the B-17G model rolled out with this chin turret as standard equipment in late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots suddenly found that their most effective attack vector had been neutralized, and head-on attacks that had been turkey shoots now resulted in German fighters flying directly into streams of half-inch bullets. Cassat Focke-Wulfs wing off in a 3-second burst. Field mechanics also added cheek guns, additional .50 positions mounted in the nose, glazing on either side of the bombardier station, giving the front of the aircraft. A total of 5 machine guns that created an overlapping field of fire no German pilot could safely penetrate. The waist gun positions were staggered to give gunners more room to operate without colliding during combat maneuvers. A new computing gun sights replaced the crude ring and bead sights that had required gunners to lead targets through pure instinct and Kentucky windage. These modifications, combined with upgraded Wright, are 1820 Cyclone engines that increase power output from 1,000 to 1. 200 horsepower transformed the B-17 from a vulnerable target into a machine that could sustain damage that seemed physically impossible and still bring its crew home. There are documented cases of B-17s returning to England with tail sections barely attached, held in place only by control cables and stringers. The entire empennage twisted 45 degrees, but somehow still, providing enough aerodynamic stability for the pilot to maintain controlled flight. Aircraft returned with entire engine nacelles blown off. 3 of 4 engines destroyed, wings shredded by flak, until you could see clear through the aluminum skin. And hydraulic systems completely shut out so that crews had to manually crank the landing gear down using emergency hand pumps while fighting G-forces during descent. The All-American flew back to base with its fuselage nearly severed after a mid-air collision with a German fighter. The bomber literally held together by longitudinal stringers while the crew could look straight down through the broken fuselage and see the ground 20,000 feet below. The Memphis Belle, piloted by Robert Morgan, completed 25 missions and sustained battle damage on nearly every sortie, yet never suffered a single crew fatality, a testament not just to luck, but to the layers of redundancy and survivability that had been engineered into the aircraft through brutal trial and error. Luftwaffe After Action reports from 1944, on which show a marked shift in German tactics and a growing sense of frustration among fighter pilots who described pumping entire ammunition loads into B-17s with minimal effect. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock wrote in his diary, after a mission intercepting bombers over Hanover, that he had made 3 attacking passes. On a single fortress, observed his cannon strikes hitting the wings and fuselage, watched the bomber continue flying in formation as if nothing had happened, an experience that left him questioning whether continuing the fight was even possible against an enemy who could absorb that level of punishment. B-17's legendary durability became a psychological weapon in itself. German pilots knew that even if they scored hits, the American bomber might not go down, and that knowledge created hesitation and fear that degraded combat effectiveness. American propaganda exploited this ruthlessly, releasing gun camera footage and nose-art photographs showing battle-damaged fortresses that looked like they'd been through a scrapyard yet had flown home, safely reinforcing the narrative that American engineering and industrial might had created an unstoppable machine. The truth was more complex. The B-17G that emerged by 1944 bore only superficial resemblance to Claire, Egtvedt's original 1934 design, having been rebuilt from the ground up through the collective experience of thousands of combat missions, hundreds of lost crews, and the desperate ingenuity of mechanics who worked through freezing English nights to armor their birds, give their friends a better chance of survival. The modifications weren't elegant or theoretically optimal. They were pragmatic solutions, welded, bolted, and riveted onto an airframe that had to evolve or be rendered obsolete by an enemy that learned and adapted with terrifying speed. What Egtvedt had created was a platform of basic design, sound enough and robust enough to accept massive modifications without collapsing under the added weight and stress. What men like Tibbets and countless unnamed mechanics created was a weapon system that could absorb 20mm cannon shells, 88mm flak fragments, and .303. Machine gun fire while keeping 10 men alive in a pressurized tube at 25,000 feet, flying through temperatures that would freeze exposed flesh in seconds, and oxygen levels that would cause unconsciousness in 90 seconds without supplemental breathing equipment. By war's end, Boeing had produced 12,731 B-17s in various models, and though 4,735 were lost in combat, the survival rate of crews in those losses was significantly higher than in any comparable bomber, because the aircraft gave them time Time to bail out. Time to fight fires. Time to transfer fuel from damaged tanks. Time to make emergency landings on fields designed for fighters, not for engine bombers. The B-17 didn't refuse to die because it was invincible. It refused to die because it had been designed, modified, and engineered by men who understood that. American air power's greatest advantage wasn't in building perfect aircraft, but in building aircraft that could be imperfect, damaged, and shot to pieces, while still completing the mission and bringing the crew home a Lever philosophy that reflected the broader American approach to warfare itself, where industrial capacity and engineering adaptability ultimately mattered more than theoretical elegance or initial battlefield superiority.